G'day guys, it's your boy Vamp here, and today I want to talk to you about Vindictus Defying Fate. Vindictus Defying Fate is a third-person action RPG, sort of Souls-like, set in a very stunning Celtic mythology-inspired world built in Unreal Engine 5. The game starts out with you selecting a character and then helping a small band of mercenaries defend their town from an ever-growing threat from the Formors or the monsters' bad guys. The game features fairly fluid and fairly brutal, fast-paced combat, similar to that of a Souls-like, however, not quite. It's got some flashier combos and different active abilities that you wouldn't usually see in those sorts of games. Now the game currently has a demo active, although it's kind of branded as an alpha as well, which is available during the Steam Next Fest for the next week or so. And I want to talk to you guys about my 15 hours or so I played in it, which involved me fighting every boss on every character, except for the very two top bosses, which I only fought on Karok, who was the main character I played. But I also want to talk about some community concerns, as well as some kind of comparisons to the original Vindictus game, which was more of an MMO. And some issues that kind of arise from those comparisons. And then I want to finish up the video by talking more about the characters and their playstyles, focusing mainly on Karok and how he plays in comparison to the others, as well as featuring some gameplay of me fighting the raid bosses that are currently like the pinnacle and only multiplayer content in the demo, which currently features 4 characters, although the original Vindictus has 26, so I assume there's going to be a lot more coming. So the demo currently features 3 separate zones, which are Colhan, the town, which is kind of your central hub for upgrading stuff and seeing other players, as well as completing quests for NPCs, as well as the Northern Ruins, which features a whole varying amount of gnolls. In saying that, they're all fairly similar, leading up to the boss, the Gnoll Chieftain Crimson Gale. And then Hotfrost Hollow, which has a bit better variety of enemy types, including a Yeti and weird dudes, with a final boss of the Chimpu Emulok. And then once you've done those 2 zones, you get access to the raids. Well, you actually have access to the raids after completing the Northern Ruins, but you are nowhere near high enough level. Right off the bat, the game gets you to select one of the characters, which later on you get the ability to swap between pretty freely. And then it puts you into a kind of short intro/tutorial, which then just teaches you the moves of the character you selected. Once you finish this, you then get to go into the character customization, which me being me, I'm playing a male character. I just make him taller because I'm really tall, and move on. Now you do get to go back and customize your character's look at any time, and of course, this being a Korean game, if you're playing a female character, you have the obvious choice of customization where you can, do this. Which, funnily enough, while recording, I had 2 different players walk up to me, as you can see here and here, dressed in the various outfits that the game has to offer in its store, which appears to be what is the basis for a microtransaction store, but for the time being, it's just using in-game currency that you earn through the battle pass and from killing monsters and stuff. In any case, once you're done with your character customization, you wake up in the Colin Inn, and from there you meet one of the main characters, although I believe in the future there's going to be a prologue with her, who is Teve, who is the Oracle of the town and one of the should be one of the main characters for the overarching story, at least going by what happened in the first game, which this seems to line up with. And then after going to the mercenary outpost and meeting a bunch of other characters, which you can see all of their designs are just absolutely visually stunning, you actually get to go out onto missions. And out on the missions, you're basically just running through the Northern Ruins, fighting off all the gnolls, going from spot to spot, checkpoint to checkpoint, and fighting the various bosses. Periodically, between beating each boss, you'll get cutscenes for the story, and maybe you have to go back to town to report on what you found. And that's kind of how the story progresses, at least for the first zone. I'll just quickly say in the second zone, it's just a straight line. You don't have to report back as much. May just be that part of the story isn't necessarily implemented or not. But yeah, not 100% sure there. And I think one thing made pretty clear by the map already is that the zones are pretty linear. You just kind of follow through. It doesn't feel too bad during the first one because it's broken up by the various story beats and the cutscenes and such. But when you get to the second zone, there is pretty much no pausing. You're just running through this pretty much straight line, fighting boss by boss. With minimal cutscenes and story progression there. And again, this could just be that they don't really have the story for the second zone in yet for the sake of the alpha/demo. And overall so far, I think the story seems pretty good, but I could just be living off the nostalgia of the first game, as a lot of it is very similar to that. In saying that, obviously the world design and the character design and just the graphics in general are really good thanks to Unreal Engine 5, although that obviously will have its drawbacks, which I will talk about later. And now we move on to the combat. The combat is fast-paced, pretty fluid and brutal action combat, as you'd come to expect from Souls-like games. In saying that, it's a little bit faster in ways and probably less punishing most of the time. However, it feels like the bosses have a lot less downtime than you'd get between certain big attacks in Souls-like games, or from staggers, for example. It feels like some of the longer combos are just borderline impossible to get off most of the time. There is not a super large variety of bosses, but I think the ones that they do have are pretty good. The starting ones are all fairly basic gnolls, and then you move on to bigger things and then more varied enemies in the second zone. Each enemy has, I guess, 4 types of attacks. You've got these kind of standard attacks that are blockable or dodgeable. You then have these yellow eye glow attacks, which you can only dodge. No block type mechanics are going to work. And then you have the blue eye attacks, which you have to perfect guard or perfect dodge, depending on your characters. Those that have blocks or Karoks absorb shock, it's called, which he blocks by attacking with certain attacks. Will have to block them, where Lan, who doesn't have a guard, has to perfect dodge. And these ones, when you counter them, you get quite a big follow-up usually, or just do an incredible amount of stagger. And then finally you have red attacks, which those red attacks are completely unblockable and undodgeable. You have to physically move out of the way. Basically, no iframes or defensive mechanics work against them, you just need to not get hit entirely. Overall, I do think the combat feels pretty good, but I think there's a few little critiques or issues I have with it. One is it can't really decide if it wants to be as fast-paced as, say, the original Vindictus, or whether it wants to be as slow as a Souls-like. I do think the cooldown abilities don't have enough impact considering how high their cooldowns are. I usually just get into a fight and use them as quickly as I can, and then usually win the fight before another one is off cooldown again. Another thing is that the different types of special attacks, like the red, blue, or yellow attacks, sometimes come out way too fast between other attacks, usually at the end of combos, or suddenly the start of the next one is just a really quick one, and they can feel very jarring when you have to switch up in like split-second sort of situations. Part of that could be a skill issue, but sometimes it just feels really hard to avoid. That could have been because I was playing Karok, where my defensive thing is attacks, where I would kind of get locked into the animation. So maybe that's where the problem came in. But then also one other issue I've had, which is more evident on Karok, who relies on attacks for his defenses, is any attack slipping between defenses just staggers you and interrupts whatever you're doing. So you could be trying to start a follow-up or chaining attacks together and it just gets interrupted, which on Karok in particular means you don't actually press your next defensive ability, which is an attack, because your chain got interrupted. That could actually be also to do with, there is a stat now called Fortitude. Fortitude, I think, might be stagger resistance, but I can't see anywhere that it's explained. Now, in terms of the various upgrades you can get, each character has their own little skill tree, which has basically the 4 active skills, plus things to either reduce the cooldown, up their damage, or grant them follow-up attacks, as well as some of their actual combo skills, like I have Dropkick and Jumbo Pounce here, also gaining follow-up attacks and just more damage. These don't change a lot. I think the follow-up attacks are the most significant part. The cooldown for the actives is like 20 seconds off a 210 second, or, you know, is a 10 seconds of an 100 second. And again, I don't think these abilities have quite enough impact for their cooldowns. But I think these, like, I've been using Jumbo Pounce with its 2 follow-ups quite a lot, and that's very good. There is also a shared passive tree, which just has like extra health flask uses, called Flovian Flask, makes them use faster, and then just kind of standard defensive stats here, as well as extra stagger damage and finisher damage and attack. All in all, the system's okay, but I think it's just rather simple and kind of unimpactful. I think it'd be a lot better if there was kind of more significant upgrades you could get, or like kind of end goal things to make more significant changes to either like play style or damage or anything like that. But you know, it is what it is for this stage of the game, and because it's very early on, it's considered an alpha still. Hopefully feedback will be used in the further development of it. Now, partway through the first zone, you get access to followers, and you may have seen in some of the footage where I have a person with me. I've mostly had Delia with me, and basically a follower is just one of the other characters who comes with you. When you unlock the follower system, that's also where you unlock the ability to change which character you are playing. The follower system seems fine. You have an extra person, however, they seem pretty useless, usually like at the very start of the fight. They will take a bunch of hits for you and die, and then after some amount of time, or if you help them, they get back up, and then they take a few hits and die again, quite often without even pulling aggro. But look, it's a cool concept. I actually kind of hope it's the basis for multiplayer within the story. On the topic of multiplayer, there is no multiplayer within the story at all. There is only multiplayer, which at the moment is only match made, and it's for the raids at the end, those 2 bosses, the White Tyrant and Bloodlord. This is kind of unfortunate, as I wanted to play more with friends, and I have very fond memories of the first game, playing through with friends for both story and the bigger bosses. And now I just kind of want to talk about some kind of issues and critiques I have with the game, as well as some community concerns that I shared some of as well. So first off, the very noticeable thing was the performance. When you first reach the town, the game runs pretty awfully. And the reason I say that is I'm running a 4080 Super and my specs are pretty high, and I was maybe getting 30 FPS in the inn and the town. I think it might just be Unreal Engine 5 having issues, maybe the settings are just a little off, but man, it ran bad, and a lot of the Steam reviews are kind of echoing that same thing. When I was outside of there, it mostly ran okay, but I did notice that certain boss fights, my frame rate was just dropping a lot just for being in the zone, not even because certain things were happening. And then I wanted to get onto the combat. As I said, it feels a bit like a Souls-like, but not quite. It seems to be trying to be faster, but then a bunch of things aren't as fluid, with like the stagger randomly happening between attacks. Again, could be a worse issue for Karok. Definitely felt like it when I was playing him. And then just this kind of sporadicness of the special attacks that you have to react a certain way to. They just feel like they come out a little too sudden, a little too random, that it's really hard to counter them unless like you can predict them, or you just don't commit to literally anything because you never know when they're going to do that. For example, Karok had this whirlwind ability that just takes a while to use, and if I start using it and then they decide that they're just going to use a unblockable move, fuck me, I guess. And then of course there's the progression. Just during the game, you just level up, and that seems fine, but the upgrading weapons and all the passives seems fairly insignificant. Outside of like the bonus attacks I previously mentioned you could get from the skill tree, and like the extra potion uses seem really good, but the individual characters, like gaining 12% damage on one of my abilities that I can use every 2 minutes, feels pretty insignificant. And those abilities that have their pretty high cooldowns feel pretty insignificant. So I definitely think some improvements could be made there. I think they potentially need to be spacing out the boss attacks just a bit more, so you have more time to pull off your kind of bigger attacks. And yeah, perhaps removing that randomness of those, you know, special uncounterable abilities. And one of the main other complaints I've seen, which I agree with to a certain extent, is how it doesn't feel enough like Vindictus, the original one. It feels a lot more like a Souls-like and kind of doesn't appear to fit itself well in between those two kind of play styles. A bunch of changes from the first have kind of made it lose some of its charm, as well as the pushing away from the MMO aspect, which has been good in some ways and bad in others. But it's really hard to tell with how early on in development it is. But one of the main things with combat is some of the identity of the game has been lost, as the original game was a lot more, I guess, power fantasy. You had more flashy attacks and stuff. For the more tactical sided kind of Souls gameplay, but it doesn't quite fit in the middle. And it's hard to really pinpoint everything that is wrong with that sort of thing. The original itself was a lot less punishing. We still had like timing for certain things, but a lot of the characters had a lot more identity there as well. As this review here says, it just says, you know, playing Fiona didn't really have a dodge in the first game. Karok was kind of similar, but she could block, and basically in this, because there's the unblockable attacks, which there's, you know, the yellow and red ones, you can't do that, and, you know, every second attack would kind of interrupt that. And there's just a whole bunch of things, like here, someone's saying, expecting a Vindictus 2, not a poor Dark Souls remastered. This guy's just saying the character models, blah, blah, blah. I don't think the rest of the game's left in the wayside. The combat's not... It's not quite Dark Souls, and yeah, it's a bit odd. However, I don't think it's bad. Although one thing I also realized after double-checking over that review and playing a bit of Vindictus, as you can see here, stamina was a thing in the first one, and it wasn't used like your Souls games where you dodge too much in a row and too bad you're out of luck. Instead, it was more of a certain abilities would use stamina, dodge included, but then you'd have ways of restoring it, which would kind of force you to change up your combos a little bit to make sure that you weren't going to be running out of stamina, with most characters having some of their toolkit to do so. But regardless of all that, I think the demo's in a pretty good spot, at least personally. 15 hours is very good for the stage that the development's in. I do hope that in the future we see kind of more features from the first one come in, whether that's more fleshed out skill systems, more impactful upgrades. Even the early days of the OG Vindictus, you had like crafting where the Gnoll Chieftain would drop parts so you can make Gnoll Chieftain armor, or he would drop them. Some enemies would drop armor, some you'd be able to craft, like weapons were usually crafted from different parts of the things. You get red metal weapons from the Gnoll Chieftain, and that was really cool. But I don't want to see a bunch of the MMO and borderline mobile feature bloat from the first one come into it, because that's kind of what ruined it. The game got so big, they streamlined a lot of things, but then they have constant, so many events in your faces, daily chores. They even have stamina system like mobile games where like each day you restore a certain amount and you get full rewards up to a certain point, and there are ways to restore it. I don't know, they added that at some point. That's kind of a bit of a mess, but like, there are a lot of things that will be good if they bring it forwards, bring the combat a little more in line with the old one, but obviously with the fresh coat of paint. And it should be a really good game. I want to see it happen. Honestly, we just have to hope and pray that Nexon doesn't ruin it the way that Nexon ruins things. The last thing I want to talk about, I mentioned earlier, is about my time playing Karok in Vindictus Defying Fate specifically, and I might talk about some of the comparisons to the original. Now, Karok's 4 main skills, active skills that is, are Shoulder Check, Whirlwind, Kodiak Rush, and Earthquake. I will show each of them in a minute. Shoulder Check's main point is to interrupt the target, stops doing what they're doing. Whirlwind then lets you spin for a while, including a extension, which you can block during. Kodiak Rush being a quick hit and knockdown for smaller targets with a follow-up as well, and Earthquake being an absolute massive chunk of damage with interrupt. Now all of these have Karoks built in absorb shock function, as well as his standard strong attacks do as well. Dropkick and Jumbo Pounce are follow-up attacks using the unique ability or guard buttons after attacks, specifically after strong attacks, and then have follow-up attacks as well. And I'll quickly run through and show how they work just against the Null Chieftain here. So I've been playing mostly on controller, and I've just come forwards to skipping running up the hill to where the Null Chieftain is. One cool thing is once you clear an area, you can go back and repeat bosses. So basically, I'll quickly go through his active abilities. So this is his shoulder check. It does the interrupt. You can see he's stopped him. We got the Whirlwind, which I can hold for quite a while. I'll get hit because that was an unblockable attack. We got the Kodiak Rush ability, which has a follow-up that charges forward and do a slam. And the big Earthquake. That does an interrupt too. You can see I got hit during because he did an unblockable. And we got the follow-ups of Jumbo Pounce here with its follow-up attacks as well. You can see I got hit at the end of my attack there. That was one of the issues I talked about. And then we have a Dropkick with its 2 follow-ups as... I was going to say 2 follow-ups as well, but I got interrupted. I was just playing OG Vindictus. The block mechanic is slightly different. Bang. Bang. Dropkick. Follow-up. Follow-up. And just avoid that one. But you can see, it's all quite good. And basically, my attack combos that I use are based on the amount of time I think I have. I fucked up. There's the blue one. I should have known that was coming. That's his attack move. But in any case, I now have some footage of me in my successful runs soloing the 2 raid bosses. Now, the White Tyrant only took me maybe like 5 attempts. The Bloodlord, however, took me like 15 to 20. And this wasn't in the very top-end gear. It was, well, sort of was. It was nearly as strong as I could be at that point. But I could have gotten stronger if I had chosen to upgrade specifically Karoks weapons, as opposed to kind of upgrading everyone's, just to make sure if I wanted to play the others, they would be strong as well. So with that, I may leave it here. Feel free to watch the remaining if you would so choose. Yeah, enjoy. And something I just want to point out here is the dodge roll into strong attack. You have a double strong attack chain. Either of those 2 strong attacks can then chain into Jumbo Pounce or Dropkick. And you see me pull this off multiple times during these fights because it's such a good way to chain your dodge roll into the absorb shock that you get on all your strong attacks. But then, of course, get hit by an unblockable. And the other issue I mentioned, which is more of a problem for Karok with how his defensive works, because you need the attacks, is that getting interrupted during your combos purely because of attack timings, when an enemy hits you, you'll notice that the 3rd attack here that the Bloodlord does just hits me between attacks. And yep, that's me just completely interrupted. I did start getting used to this a bit, but it was really annoying early on, especially when chaining into jumbo pounce or dropkick, because those buttons don't do anything if you're not already in a combo.